I would like to introduce Jason Anderson as our first presenter. Jason is responsible for planning, implementing, and managing riparian restoration projects. He works on invasive plant surveys and control, stewardship of Stillaguamish Tribe-owned conservation lands, and until recently, as a native plant nursery at a native plant nursery. Prior to working for the tribe, his position at the Regional Fisheries Enhancement Group, which is now called the Sound Salmon Solutions, centered around project management for instream, fish passage, and riparian restoration projects. With that, I will let Jason take it away.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction.
Yes.
I hope in the next 45 minutes that I can share some information about the riparian planting monitoring program that we have going on here at Stillaguamish Tribe Natural Resources. A brief overview of what I hope to cover today. We're going to go over the background for this particular monitoring program. We're going to discuss the purpose of monitoring. We're going to talk about riparian restoration monitoring goals and objectives. I'm going to share an example from a project location, Lower Vos Creek. I'm going to discuss some training considerations, and then we have a few tips and tricks and some lessons learned to share with you all. And then also going to go into another project example at the Trafton Floodplain site. And this is to give you some insights on some pre-project monitoring. A little background first. So prior to 2015, our department performed monitoring on a more ad hoc basis. We really didn't have a formal program. In 2015, I sat down with my supervisor at the time and we started looking at a few different options for riparian monitoring. We looked at a variety of existing programs with an eye toward figuring out what would work well for our needs here at Stillaguamish. In 2016, we applied for and were awarded a grant from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They have this Pacific Salmon Treaty money available, and we were awarded a grant to create a monitoring plan. So the goal of that project was to increase the tribe's capacity to evaluate riparian habitat conditions throughout the basin in order to better understand current conditions and to monitor riparian restoration projects. Phase one of that effort focused on development of field and office protocols for mapping, data collection, analysis, as well as outputs like reports. We initially proposed collecting data on vegetation characteristics, such as installed native plant survival. We also wanted to look at aerial coverage of non-native or invasive plants, and we also wanted to look at canopy cover of these areas. We also incorporated a component for evaluating soil characteristics, such as looking at soil chemistry, fertility, and composition. Phase two focused on testing our protocols to ensure a smooth workflow, and we did some refining of our work products, and then we also worked on disseminating results. We envisioned at the time either an annual report composed of chapters detailing site-specific characteristics, or a site-specific report composed of chapters with annual data, or some combination of the two. We weren't quite sure how we wanted to approach that. In phase three, we made some substantial refinements, and then we continued collecting field data and writing reports. And what we've settled on for the reports was that we would write one report for each property. These reports kind of serve as a trend report that incorporates data as well as observations by monitoring year for each restored polygon or each planting phase completed. So, as we know, monitoring is the process of collecting and analyzing information to track progress and to inform decision making. Results of monitoring are useful because they can inform riparian restoration project planning, implementation, and adaptive management. Results of monitoring are also useful because we use them to disseminate information to tribal members, leaders, as well as stakeholders, and this could be grant managers or private landowners on whose property we're working, as well as restoration practitioners like you all today. Okay, so the objectives of our riparian restoration monitoring are threefold. We hope to describe physical and vegetation characteristics. to document implementation of riparian restoration project activities, and to evaluate effectiveness of riparian restoration projects in terms of meeting site-specific restoration objectives. Little terminology. We're going to be talking about 3 types of monitoring, and we use these terms internally. So pre-project monitoring is done to document the pre-restoration conditions. Implementation, or as-built monitoring, documents conditions at the end of the restoration project, and it seeks to answer the question, did we do what we said we were going to do? Then effectiveness monitoring aims to answer the question of whether project objectives are being met. Effectiveness monitoring informs maintenance or adaptive management needs and can inform planning for future projects. This type of monitoring seeks to answer the question, by doing what we said we would do, did we accomplish our goals and objectives, and are we moving toward our desired future condition? Okay, so here are some examples of restoration objectives. We don't necessarily include all of these for all our restoration projects, but let's step through these. So planting extent corresponds with metrics that we're all pretty familiar with. These are commonly associated with grant requirements. These are the outputs, and they can include things like acres treated, or river miles, or linear feet restored. Okay, so with respect to native plants, we could choose to include some diversity metrics, such as a species diversity. And that's essentially measuring the number of different species present and their relative abundance. We could also include some structural diversity metrics. And these are an assessment of the physical arrangement of the plants, and it could include factors like canopy height or canopy cover. So in general, we would like to see increasing trends when it comes to native plant related objectives. So when it comes to invasive plants or noxious weeds, the opposite is often true, right? We want to see decreasing trends. So the objective for, say, a non-native invasive plant species diversity might be to eliminate one or more species from a restoration area if we feel that eradication is feasible. This metric could be coupled with a reduction in aerial extent for one or more non-native invasive plants. So again, these are examples of restoration objectives, and obviously you'll need to use your professional judgment about which objectives to include for each restoration project area. And keep in mind when you're writing these objectives to try to use SMART objectives. Now, SMART is an acronym, right? And SMART refers to specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So keep SMART objectives in mind when you're creating them. Okay, so here's a table that I hope to try to illustrate an example for a sequence of events to show how the monitoring efforts interact with commonly done riparian restoration activities. So as the column on the left, we see the years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So say you start a project in year 1 and you would proceed with initial weed control, then in year 2, do some follow-on weed control, and then that winter of year 2, moving into year 3, you do your riparian planting, year 3, some additional weed control, and you close your project. Pretty simple, 3-year duration project, okay? So on the right-hand side, we can then correspond and line up our monitoring plan activities. So again, the pre-project monitoring is designed to document the pre-restoration conditions, and that would be best done after you start the project, but before you start your weed control. After the riparian planting is complete, implementation monitoring documents your as-built conditions. So that would be done following your riparian planting. In subsequent years, the effectiveness monitoring occurs according to the schedule that you prescribe in your monitoring protocols. So in this example, we've got effectiveness years 1, 2, 3, and 5. So by effectiveness year 5, we would hope to be able to detect some changes with respect to pre-project and implementation monitoring results. And oftentimes, we will start transitioning away in year 5 away from doing individual plant counts, say by species or by plant category, because we found that in general, once plants persist this long, they are established. So in year 5, this is when we start sampling our structural diversity metrics like canopy cover, and we would measure it with, say, a densiometer, or we might measure canopy height with a stadia rod or clinometer. Okay, so a few notes on office work and field work. In the office, we decide which sampling method that we will employ. So in our case, plots or transects, and how much area we are going to sample. So our protocol directs us to sample at least 10% of the riparian restoration project area. So for example, if you have a restoration area that's 10 acres, we would choose, and if we choose, say, the plot method, what we would want to do is set up plots that add up to 1 acre. And for example, if we choose 100-foot by 100-foot square plots, we would need 5 plots. So 5 plots at 10,000 square feet per plot, that's greater than 43,560 square feet in an acre, okay? So the plot method obviously is used to evaluate vegetation within polygons, and these plots can be any shape. It can be a square, a circle, or a rectangle. It really doesn't necessarily matter. The transect method is used to evaluate vegetation along a line, and often we will use belt transects. We also use the concept of a baseline, and a baseline is simply a line from which the plots or the transects originate. Now, once we're in the field, the first thing we would do would be to establish the baseline. We would install wooden posts at the start and the end, flag them, and collect GPS points of their locations. From the baseline, we would delineate the plots or transects, and then once the sampling area is established, we would proceed with collecting information. We would do our photo points, we would collect information on physical characteristics, as well as characteristics of native and invasive plants. Okay, so let's step through a quick example. On the left, you can see a schematic of a generic riparian area planting polygon next to a water body. So remember back to the sequence of events. Once you've delineated your planting area, but before you initiate weed control, it's time to complete the pre-project monitoring. Again, this is to document pre-restoration conditions. Next steps often include additional weed control, planting, and then their follow-on weed control. These are your restoration project activities. However, prior to project completion, your implementation monitoring would be performed. Again, this allows you to document conditions after planting is complete for comparison to pre-project conditions and future project conditions. So here's a schematic of how we might lay out plots or transects to define the sample area. Again, sampling occurs within the polygons or along the transects. In this example, note that the baseline is not a straight line. We have found that at times it is necessary to use an inflection point somewhere along the baseline. An inflection point is simply where the baseline changes its bearing, and inflection points should be marked. We do mark inflection points, and we do collect GPS points of those locations too. So I'd like to share an actual project as an example to help illustrate the process. So in 2018, the Stillaguamish Tribe signed a landowner agreement with a private landowner and began a restoration project on their property along lower Vos Creek. The aim was to expand riparian forest to benefit fish and wildlife and protect a documented cold water input into lower Jim Creek. Initial site preparation weed control began in 2018, and initial riparian planting occurred in 2019. So in the map, you can see the planting boundary outlined in light green. The blue line represents the alignment of Vos Creek. The baseline and sample plots 1, 2, and 3 are labeled, and the orange dot inside of the plots indicate photo points. So at the outset of the project, we established restoration objectives for reducing non-native invasive weed aerial coverage, as well as increasing native plant density and diversity. And the non-native invasive plants at this property included non-native blackberry, we had Himalayan and evergreen blackberry, We had reed canary grass and creeping thistle. So here are some images we took from the photo points in 2023. Plot 1 is 100 feet by 100 feet. And you can see the herbivory deterrents that we installed. The classic blue tubes were installed on single stem plants, and we used these black tubes around conifers and shrubs with multiple stems. These are a little bit more bushy plants. And quick side note, these black tubes are composed of rigid plastic mesh panels held together with zip ties and staked to the ground with wood or bamboo stakes. The open mesh allows air flow flows through the plant, and it helps protect the plant from damage as well. And I just wanted to put it out there, if you would like to learn more about these black tubes and maybe use some in your restoration planting projects, please get a hold of me. We have a lot of these, and we'd be willing to share some with you because we're curious. We like them a lot, and we'd like to hear some feedback on some other groups in terms of their performance. Images from plot 2, again, same size, 100 feet by 100 feet. Plot 3 is a smaller plot. It's 50 feet by 50 feet due to the configuration of the planting polygon. So these 3 sample plots sum up to 22,500 square feet, or about 0.52 acres, which represents roughly 9% of the planting area. It's a little shy of our stated goal of sampling 10% of the planting area, but it was just how the layout worked out best. So when we're writing our reports, we use a table like this to summarize our monitoring results. As you can see, our restoration objectives are listed in the first column. And again, objectives for this project included reducing the non-native invasive weed coverage to less than 20%, as well as increasing native plant density and diversity. The second column lists a predicted plant density value. So this is kind of a unique thing. So let me describe what this is. So this is a metric that we calculate by dividing the total number of conifers, deciduous trees, and shrubs installed within the entire planting area by the total area planted. In subsequent years, we can compare the observed post-planting density by plant category to not only the predicted plant density, but also to our restoration objectives. The predicted plant density metric also serves as a coarse indicator of how randomly the planting crew distributed and installed the plants. In this case, the planting plan prescribed a spacing for plants, but it did not include any requirements for spacing based on plant category. The 2019 column represents our implementation monitoring results. 2020, 2021, and 2023 columns represent effectiveness monitoring results. So as of 2023, we were not meeting the noxious weed percent cover or the number of shrubs per acre objectives. We were meeting the other objectives. And currently, we are in the adaptive management review and evaluation phase, and we're discussing whether additional weed control is warranted and whether additional shrubs should be planted. Okay, quick note on inputs and outputs. So inputs refer to the type of information we collect in the field. Plant counts refer to native plants within polygons or belt transects. Observation information refers to disturbance. It could be browse, insect damage, or wind throw. Percent cover is qualitatively evaluated and given a number. We have discussed maybe not using a number, but transitioning to a range. So for example, it could be greater than 25%, but less than 50%. But we're still kind of trying to hash that out. Outputs include written reports for each site summarizing observations, as well as a discussion of monitoring results for each year of monitoring. A few notes on training consideration. If you plan to have samplers identify plants to a species level, you've got to ensure that they receive training and have sufficient knowledge of resources available to make these determinations quickly. Stopping to use Google Lens or Plant Snap on every plant is inefficient. Pre-season training helps get all samplers on the same page. So for example, if data needs to be collected and it would include aerial coverage of, say, non-native invasive plants in a sample plot, it might be good to have all samplers come up with their own estimates independently and then discuss and agree on what value should be recorded. This kind of helps train everyone's eyes so that they're kind of seeing the same thing. Make sure you have written protocols for all parameters to be sampled and review the protocols annually. And when you're doing training, encourage samplers to ask clarifying questions, especially if you're working with new staff or temporary field crews. The overall goal, of course, is to reduce errors. Okay, a few tips and tricks. We have learned that electric fence polytape on a reel is a great way to delineate plot boundaries as well as transects. We've learned a lot and we've had to revise our protocols and practices. Keep in mind your overall monitoring goals when you are considering revisions. We've also learned that when you have a fairly simple project, the one that I shared, the example that I shared at Vos Creek, one polygon, relatively small scale, these protocols work just fine. However, when we began to try to utilize these protocols on multi-phase projects at larger properties, keeping track of which protocols should be performed in any given year became a lot more difficult to manage. And it also increased the amount of time that we needed to do the data collection, the subsequent analysis, as well as report writing. So a few things to consider. So since we are subsampling 10% of the overall area planted, the results have to be interpreted. The sample area may or may not adequately represent the entire planting area. So with that, choose your sample areas with that in mind and continually ask, is the sample area a fair representation of the overall planting area? The planting area polygons themselves may be different from surrounding areas on the property. For example, does the planting area kind of fill in a gap within an otherwise intact riparian plant community? If so, the weed load within that area might be very different than the surrounding, say, forest or other plant community. And again, when it does come to phased plantings at a property, we have struggled to keep track of the monitoring that needs to be done in any given year with respect to each individual polygon. So at some point in time, it might make sense to align your effectiveness monitoring for the sake of efficiency. Additional things to consider. So currently, when we are doing our as-built implementation monitoring and our year 5 effectiveness monitoring, we identify plants to species. This is realistic for implementation monitoring because it is typically done in the spring or summer following the planting. However, by year 5, if a plant is missing or unable to be identified, we ran into a problem. So we've made some refinements in the last couple of years. We realize that plant ID to species can be time-consuming, so when it comes to effectiveness monitoring, what we've done is we've adopted a slightly different approach. We've developed the concept of using plant categories like conifers, deciduous trees, and shrubs to speed things up. We simply lump each plant encountered when we're sampling into a category and then assign it an alive or dead status. We've also created 2 additional categories. We've created a missing and an unknown category. So a missing plant is one where we have a plant protector, but nothing inside, right? Or we have a gap in a planting row. An unknown plant is one where the plant is present, but we just don't know what it is. It's just a stick in a tube, or it was so heavily browsed that it's undeterminable about what it was. So at the implementation monitoring, we do capture species and location data, but we found that it takes a lot of time to go back to that previous data to determine the species of those missing or unknown plants. So these refinements were made as an acknowledgement of the fact that we have numerous sites to visit in a short time frame each summer, and we're adding additional monitoring work with each restoration planting area that we've completed. Okay, so what if disturbance impacts your sample area? This could be biotic disturbance like browse from elk, deer, beaver, or small rodents, or even damage from people. It could also include abiotic disturbance such as flooding or wind throw. So in the photo on the left, you're looking upstream at the North Fork Stillaguamish River. In the far left part of the photo, you can see a wood post with a band of orange flagging at the top. I've got an orange arrow there pointing to it. This post marks one corner of a square sample plot that has been impacted by lateral erosion. It should go without saying, establish your sample areas far away or far enough away from the edge of water bodies so as to facilitate future sampling. We did a poor job of anticipating the rate of bank loss at this location, and now our sample plot has been compromised. The photos at the right show the after effects of a flood. Many plants were missing following the flood in this sample area. Another image of post-flood conditions at a sample area. We know that floodplains are dynamic ecosystems and that disturbance is bound to occur. So when you are developing your sample protocols, as well as laying out your sample areas, keep in mind that current conditions as you see them today may look dramatically different in future sampling years. Okay, so I'm going to transition now into a slightly different example of monitoring. So this is slightly related to disturbance though. So we've used a modified approach of using our monitoring plots, and in this case, we are trying to inform future riparian restoration. So in 2019, the Stillaguamish Tribe purchased several parcels along the left bank of the North Fork Stillaguamish River near River Mile 4 and began planning a large-scale restoration project. The long-term goal of this project is to increase critically important riverine and wetland habitat for fish, wildlife, and bird species, and especially to benefit the abundance and productivity of threatened salmonids, including chinook, bull trout, and steelhead. So in the map, you can see the Trafton Floodplain Restoration Project boundary outlined in red. The blue stripes represent Snohomish County property, and the red cross-hatching is Stillaguamish Tribe-owned property. The county and the tribe are partnering on this project, and it's slated to go to construction this summer. Project elements at the Trafton floodplain location include earthwork for wetland and side channel excavation, as well as construction of large wood floodplain roughness features. And so we anticipate there's going to be extensive soil disturbance. So, knowing that, in the beginning stages of planning, we established a near-term objective of reducing both extent and density of invasive plants. And you can read this list of all the invasive plants that we identified on the site. So during the summers of 2021 through 2024, just last summer, we performed extensive mowing, herbicide application, as well as some handwork. The aim was to prevent spreading known patches of invasive plants during the course of future earthwork associated with restoration construction. So in this map, you can see our 2024 survey and control efforts. The blue lines are the survey track lines. Yellow dots are treated patches of invasive plants. Predominantly, these are knotweed patches. However, some of them are poison hemlock patches, as well as tansy ragwort and reed canary grass. The red dots are untreated, but these were untreated at the time we did the survey, but they have been subsequently treated. They've been injected with herbicide. These were non-native ornamental trees that were spreading. There were some ornamental plum, there was a flowering pear, and I believe a number of Asian elm, some kind of an elm variety from Asia that just had some extensive suckering going out. So we're in the process of trying to get those under control prior to moving soil around. So again, here's some images of the different phases of weed control. Again, a lot of mowing, herbicide application, and a lot of handwork. We targeted a variety of non-native invasive plants. So when it came to knotweed, after 3 years of targeting patches with foliar herbicide, we were able to reduce the density to such an extent that we had several areas that were essentially reduced to bare soils, where knotweed was previously dominant. And the one thing we observed was that a variety of plants were recruiting within these areas. So we wanted to document what was coming in once the knotweed canopy was so dramatically reduced. So in 2024, we devised a modest monitoring effort and outlined some questions that we set out to answer. Specifically, we wanted to learn whether native plants are coming back on these bare soils. We also wanted to learn if non-native plants were coming in. We also wanted to generate some species diversity and maybe some relative abundance estimates for both the native and the non-native plants. So in September, we set up some plots and collected data on all the plants in the plots. We also tried to evaluate the amount of bare soil as well as the dominant canopy trees in the vicinity. And we identified areas of the property that experienced disturbance to address our question, because these were the best analog that we had at the time to the future conditions that we anticipate will be associated with that earthwork for the restoration construction. So in one area, the dense knotweed stands that we had treated with herbicide for 2 to 3 years, we estimated that the percent cover of knotweed was reduced from 100% to maybe 5 to 10%. In the second area where knotweed density was sparse, there was a flood event in December of 2023, which resulted in overbank flow and associated scour, and it scoured out a roughly 100-yard long by 50-yard wide section of this perimeter berm. And so we kind of had to make the assumption that these two areas would have to serve as an analog for post-restoration soil disturbance conditions. So in the map, you can see the location of our 5 sample plots. It's probably too small for you to read the numbers, but the 2 plots in the north, those are plots 1 and 2, and then the 2 plots in the south are plots 3 and 4, and then the single plot in between the other 2 groups, that was plot 5. So plot 5 was associated with the scoured bank. Plots 1 and 2, 3 and 4 were in areas with knotweed, canopy reduction, and then plot 5 was scour. Each sampled plot was 10 feet by 10 feet square, and we initially wanted to do more plots. However, we were constrained by time and budget restrictions. So 5 plots it was. So here's a brief overview of the plants that were observed, and I've restricted the results to the top 6 most commonly observed plants in both native and non-native categories. And we chose to focus on these plants, or those plants that we would typically be concerned with in a riparian restoration project, okay? So for example, we didn't really worry too much about native forbs or ferns or invasive plants or noxious weeds like common tansy or sweet clover. We kind of just set those aside. And those, anyway, so as you can see in the table, red alder was the most abundant native tree sampled, and it was observed in 4 of the 5 plots. Black cottonwood was the second most abundant native tree. However, it was primarily found in plot 5. That was the plot associated with the scouring of the bank. Salmonberry was the most abundant native shrub. It occurred in all 5 plots. Red elderberry and thimbleberry were also observed, but less so than salmonberry. When it comes to the non-native invasive plants, Himalayan blackberry was by far the most abundant non-native plant, and it was observed in 4 of the 5 plots. Reed canary grass and butterfly bush were observed just in plots 1 and 5. Knotweed was present in 3 plots. It was only about 1 to 2 feet high, and it looked really stressed. And then, of course, bull thistle and Scotch broom, we did notice a few plants in plot 5. Again, that was the one associated with scour. So we also generated these 2 simple pie charts to try to graphically depict the relative abundance of those top 6 native plants, shown in blue, and then the top 6 non-native plants, that's in orange. So a chart on the left shows pooled data for all plots, and roughly 63% of all plants observed were native and 37% were non-native. And the chart on the right shows the breakdown by plot. So we can use these charts to really quickly visually compare the relative proportion of native and non-native plants within each sample plot. So for example, if you're comparing vegetation plot number 1, so VP1, we see that the native plants comprise roughly double the amount of non-native plants. And another example, if you look at vegetation plot 3, so VP3, the proportions are roughly equivalent. So in response to our initial questions, we learned that native plants are germinating on exposed soils. Samplers identified native trees, including red alder and black cottonwood, as well as a variety of native shrubs. Samplers also identified non-native invasive plants in the plots, and given that Himalayan blackberry, reed canary grass, and knotweed are already established at the site, this was not a surprising result. It was encouraging to note that native plants outnumbered non-native invasive plants nearly 2 to 1 within the sample plots. However, if disturbed soils associated with that restoration construction are suitable for non-native invasive plant recruitment, we anticipate that our post-construction weed control efforts will have to be pretty substantial. We are a little hesitant to estimate future density or abundance of native or non-native invasive plants based on the limited scope and scale of our sampling effort. However, again, these results underscore the need for a robust stewardship plan that includes survey and control of invasive plants following construction activities. So in
Hey,
summary,
Jason, this is your 5-minute warning.
Outstanding, I think we're there. So in summary, the Stillaguamish Tribe Natural Resources Department has developed a monitoring program. We aim to describe physical and vegetation characteristics. We aim to document implementation of riparian restoration project activities. And we hope to evaluate effectiveness of riparian restoration projects in terms of meeting site-specific restoration objectives. We began in 2016, and we have learned a lot over the years. The biggest challenge has been finding funding to continue the effort. The second biggest challenge has been getting trained staff together for our field data collection. I work with our natural resources technicians who do a great job, but we have to fit in the monitoring between various other projects, so scheduling becomes crucial. Despite these challenges, we continue to monitor riparian restoration projects to the best of our ability. And with that, I'll conclude and ask if there are any questions.
We have a question about herbivory deterrent tubes. Have you tested the efficacy of different types of plant protection in your monitoring?
That is a good question. We have used different herbivory protection devices. We've used the blue tubes, we've used the black tubes like I described. We've also used a fabric tube that is made by a company out of Canada, and I'm totally blanking on the name of that one. And I don't think we've done any testing per se. I think it's been more of observation in terms of which tubes work well in different environments. We have found that at times the blue tubes they don't breathe as well, and so we have had some fungus issues on plants within blue tubes, and the black tubes, we don't have that because there's a lot more airflow through them. We only have a few of the fabric tubes, so I'm a little hesitant to speculate on those, but the fabric tubes are nice because the ones that we received, I believe, are 4 feet high, so they do a great job protecting the plant stem from deer and elk rubbing.
And in what years post-restoration do you recommend monitoring?
Well, again, I think it depends on a couple of things. One, it depends on the capacity of your organization to be able to not only devote to this task. There is value in collecting monitoring information to help you tell a story, especially if you need to tell your story to your leaders, the leadership within your organization, and also to demonstrate that you are meeting your goals and your objectives that you've outlined in your grant applications. I don't like the idea of monitoring just for monitoring. I think you have to be very clear with when you want to monitor and what you hope to learn from it. And you could go out every single year and do the exact same monitoring, but if you're just going and counting the same plants and they're persisting and they are established, then it seems to me to be not a good use of time. However, in contrast, if you're going out to an area and you're documenting major impacts to your riparian restoration area, and you need to then intervene in such a way as to adapt and change your approach, then that's useful, because I think whatever protocols you're putting in place have to be realistic, and you have to be getting the information that you want to learn, as opposed to doing it for somebody else's benefit or gain again. And it comes back to what your leaders want. Like for us, it's tribal leadership. They want to know how we're doing, and so that's who we're most responsive to.
Are there concerns or considerations regarding plant tubes washing away during flood events?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of our biggest concerns. And we don't like putting plant protectors in the vicinity of actively eroding banks, because we don't want plastic getting recruited to the water bodies. We also have to balance that with the need sometimes to put those herbivory deterrents on, because if we don't put them on and we lose all of our plants to browse, then that's not useful either. So at times what we'll do is we will not put the herbivory deterrent tubes on the plants within a certain number of feet of the water body if we notice that it is an actively eroding bank.
What physical, environmental data you collect as part of monitoring? Do you record soil texture, aspect, existing canopy cover, or other similar conditions to help contextualize survivorship and success metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't go into a lot of detail on some of the parameters that we monitor. And again, I kind of had to keep it brief to stay within the time constraints. But yeah, when it comes to physical characteristics, we are looking at soil texture. We actually take soil samples and we have them analyzed at a soils lab. And so that's helpful to understand what the soil is like in terms of not only composition, but also its fertility and things like that. When it comes to physical characteristics, yes, we'll try to define either the aspect of the planting area. A lot of our planting areas are in floodplain areas, right? And so they tend to be fairly flat, but we do try to describe topographic features if we see depressions or we see any changes in topography, even slight changes in topography, we'll try to map those. However, it's becoming more useful to use LiDAR images to try to suss that out as opposed to doing any physical mapping on site. We also try to take a look at, we try to assess the amount of ground that's vegetated versus non-vegetated. So if there's bare patches of soil, we try to map those. And other physical characteristics. Obviously, we can generate a lot of the basic stuff like elevation from the office.
How did you come up with the parameters in your restoration objectives?
That's a good question. I mean, I think oftentimes we are essentially trying to do the main goal of doing a restoration planting project when you have, say, open field and you're trying to convert that to a riparian forest. Obviously, we are trying to increase plant density, native plant density. And at the same time, in general, we're trying to reduce non-native plant extent. And so what we try to do is figure out what is a manageable goal or an objective in the near term, but then we also try to put a longer term objective as well, with the understanding that in a lot of these restoration sites, especially if we're working on property that's owned by Stillaguamish Tribe, we will have the opportunity to return in, say, 5 or 10 years to do some supplemental work. And we'll approach those slightly differently than, say, if we're working on a private landowner's property where we may not necessarily have the luxury of returning in 5 or 10 years because we just don't know if they will change ownership or something like that. So our approach is probably a little bit more plant heavy in terms of putting a lot of plants on the ground on a private landowner's plant, whereas with tribal-owned properties, we might do a more nuanced approach in the sense we might set a more modest near-term goal of establishing some early successional plants with the idea that those then will be supplemented with some additional conifers in years to come. And then we can we can use those two sets of, we can have near-term objectives and we can have longer-term objectives, which might look at a 10 or a 15-year time frame out from when we're doing our initial planning.
How are you funding your work?
Up till now, well, I would say for many years we were receiving those BIA PST funds, and now we are looking at trying to figure out how we're going to transition and not use those BIA PST funds, because those are currently being used in a different capacity now to support work of other staff in our department. So TBD, but I'm working on that.
What have you done to deter beavers from your new plantings?
I would have to say that in many cases when we're working on tribal-owned property, we are doing very little to deter beavers from those plantings in the form of physical barriers. We are taking the approach of allowing the beavers to come in and disrupt our plantings, and we're responding with heavy planting. We've had mixed success, to be honest, but we currently have little support to try to remove the beavers from those tribal-owned properties. Our direction has been, or we've been given the direction to work with them and not against them.